Hello everyone, and welcome to the AI guest speaker series. My name is Vivek Krishnamurthy, and I work as an applied research scientist here at Snorkel. My research focus is primarily around computer vision and multimodal foundation models, specifically in how these models can be fine-tuned on customer-specific data and yield better representation for a variety of downstream domain-specific tasks. Once again, I'd like to thank Dia as well as members of our audience for taking the time to be here. Our main motivation behind the AI guest speaker series is to invite leading researchers in the field and give them an opportunity to showcase their work to an enterprise audience. And at the same time, give fellow ML AI professionals a chance to see what cutting edge research in AI looks like and see whether it is relevant for them in the enterprise setting. So quick introduction about Dia. Our guest today is Dyah Adila, who is a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's advised by Fred Sala, who is also our chief scientist at Snorkel. Dia's research interests are in building robust and reliable machine learning solutions, especially in settings where access to labeled data is limited. Recently, she has been focusing on robustifying foundation models. So today she'll be talking about her recent work, Roboshot, which is a method that improves the robustness of pre-trained model embeddings in a fully zero-shot fashion without any additional fine-tuning required. So yeah, the floor is yours, Dia. Take it away.
Thanks for the introduction and thanks everyone for having me. So in today's talk, I'm going to discuss about zero-shot adaptations of foundation models. This is a joint work with folks in the lab, Chang Ho, Chris, and also our advisor, Fred. I guess first of all, why do we all care so much about foundation models? Because it's a tool or an out-of-the-box tool that we can use just without us having to do any pre-training or any training. We can just ask it like complicated questions that we usually ask to Google, and then we can get the answer that we need. Also, if let's say we want to build an image classification system, unlike 2 or 3 years ago where we have to take a pre-trained ResNet and then train it again on our data set, we can just take clip models out of the box, give it our image and the labels that we want it to predict, and then it can give us quite a good predictions. The hope is we can just use these models out of the box without having to fine-tune it on our downstream tasks. However, in reality, most of the time, it's not really the case. For example, for open source LLM like Llama, Vicuna, and stuff like that, oftentimes the base version cannot really distinguish which kind of query that is possibly harmful to answer, and it could just give an answer which it's not supposed to do. And for clip models, if we want to do a very specific downstream task, for example, building a bird classification, then most often than not, we still need to kind of fine tune it using our downstream data set. So I guess these companies that built these models already spend billions of dollars and then collect a lot of data to produce this clip or models, but then us as the users of this model again have to do further fine-tuning or adaptation of these models, which takes more effort or money from our side. So this leads us to the main question, and that I'm going to discuss in this talk is can we adapt these pre-trained models that actually already have huge capabilities without having to do additional training, without having to collect more data and spend more compute? That sounds like a challenging and complicated task. So first, I guess let's break down what components that fine-tuning needs, and then let's kind of see if we can find a cheaper replacement for these components. So for fine-tuning, most often than not, we need a labeled data. So for example, in aligning LLM tasks or to make it more safe, we need this kind of data that annotates whether a question or a response is safe or not. And this takes human annotators, which then again takes time and money. And for clip, let's say we also need a downstream data that's labeled data. And then once we have the data, again, we have to kind of do fine-tuning for clip or also like RLHF or DPO on like LLM to finally get the final model that we can use for the deployment. Essentially, these two components is really, for labeled data, is just like a way to describe the knowledge that we want this model to like absorb more. And then like a learning algorithm is like our way to kind of instill this extra knowledge that we want the model to learn. The two works that I'm going to present today in this talk is going to revolve around finding the zero-shot alternatives of both labeled data and learning processes and see if it works. So there's like two works that I'm going to present today. First one is Roboshot that we already is going to be published in ICLR 2024. So basically, this method works for embedding-based models like CLIP. And I'm going to also briefly touch on a work in progress where we kind of want to expand Roboshot to more complicated models like LLMs. First, I'm going to like describe the motivation behind Roboshot. So like big models like CLIP, usually the data that is used to pre-train is crawled from the internet. So when we pre-train this CLIP model into like this internet crawled data set, we cannot really control what kind of knowledge that the model learns or not. So more often than not, there is like patterns in the training data that holds for like a lot of cases, but is not necessarily true. So like here, for example, if we want the model to learn to detect like pacifiers, because in the training data, pacifiers more often than not appears with a baby. So then the classifier learns the association between a baby and a pacifier. And when we test it on like data slices that not necessarily like doesn't follow this like spurious associations in the training data, then the model can give us a wrong prediction. So CLIP kind of like absorbs these spurious correlations in the training data. And what we want to do with Roboshot is to improve CLIP so that it instead use like the correct features to make predictions. In this case, like make predictions based on an actual existence of pacifiers instead of looking for a baby.
Yeah, one quick question. Can you go back to the previous slide? What did you use to get these heat maps in these cases?
Oh, I just take this from like another paper, but then like this is usually like with GradCam.
With GradCam, okay, thank you.
So first of all, I'm going to kind of briefly discuss on how CLIP makes prediction, and then we kind of go from there on how Roboshot works. Basically, in like embedding-based model like CLIP, how we want to make prediction is if, let's say, we have a image sample, and we also have to give it like a list of labels that, the possible labels that we want it to predict to, then we get the image embedding and also the labels embedding. And then the classification is simply made by taking a dot product between the image embedding and all the labels embedding. And then the prediction is taken based on like which label has the highest cosine similarity with the image. More often than not, like as we speak about the spurious correlations in the previous slide, let's say in this case, when we want to classify a water bird versus land bird, then because in the dataset, the pre-training dataset, water bird most often than not appear in front of a water and land bird appears in front of a land. So there is like a spurious correlations between like the bird type and the background. So let's say, for example, here in the embedding that is produced by CLIP, when we give the image of like a land bird in front of water, then there are like water components in the embedding and also the bird components in the embedding. So the CLIP-based model, because there's like a higher similarity between like the water bird embedding and the image embedding, it could make a wrong prediction. So if there's only a way to like make us tell the CLIP to kind of don't look at the top 3 features, just kind of look at the bird features, then we're good to go. So to start like we kind of just make this simple theoretical model. So basically, we model a clip embedding as a mixture of a harmful component, helpful component, and a benign component. So in our simple waterbirds case, this harmful component is like the background, and then helpful is the actual image feature. And I just want to clarify here that in the real case, we only see this X. We only observe the embedding that is given by the clip, and we do not observe anything at all on the right-hand side. This is like a theoretical model that we do not observe which feature is harmful, helpful, and benign. But with this simple theoretical model, we can kind of like narrow down our objective into reducing the coefficient of the harmful component and increasing the coefficient of the helpful component in the embedding. Because like we do not want to use labeled data, then how do we kind of instill this knowledge to the clip? Like how do we kind of tell it, well, don't look at the background, just look at the bird. If we have labeled data and do fine tuning, like probably like the learning can kind of instill this knowledge because we probably have like samples of water bird in front of land and land bird in front of water. But then because we don't want to use it, we kind of need like a source of knowledge that kind of tell us for this very specific classification task, like which feature do we want to use and which feature do we want to avoid. In this project, we use like language model as this oracle. So basically we can just kind of ask language model, this is the task that I want to do. Can you give me like the features that's probably spurious so that I could avoid it? And also the features that is actually useful so I could use it. And the answers that's given in the language model will be in form of like a textual form. So in here, for example, we have like, well, do not look at the habitat or like the background. So now we get this textual form of the features that we want to avoid or we want to use. We probably should do the modification in the embedding space. So the next step is to kind of get this embedding from the ChatGPT or language model answers. This is also just like a next example of we can do more complicated tasks more than just like classifying land birds versus water bird. We can get these like feature description from ChatGPT or other language model for even more complicated tasks like review sentiment. The next part of the question is like, how do we force the clip to actually use these features that we already get from the ChatGPT? Again, we are going to like modify the model behavior in the embedding space. So this is like once we get the embedding of the text that we get from ChatGPT. So we borrow techniques from this literature called the embedding debiasing, which basically the goal is to like, given a word embedding, we kind of want to remove certain concepts from it. So for example, if we want to get a good embedding of like occupation, then we do not want this embedding to be influenced by like gender. We just want it to like be fully about the occupation. So embedding debiasing technique basically work that it projects the embedding into a space that is less influenced or like invariant towards the concepts that it doesn't want. So in this example here on the right, it kind of projects it to the subspace where it is invariant against the gender. So the hope is like once we perform like embedding biasing on an embedding, the influence from a certain concept will be minimized. That's kind of what we do in Roboshot too, but because we do not necessarily need the embedding to be fully invariant against like the concepts that we don't want, what we do in Roboshot is really simple. So given like the image embedding that we want to make a classification on, in this case is the X, we just subtract X to the projection of X to the harmful component. So this phi harmful is just the text embedding of the answers that we get from ChatGPT. So intuitively, it's just subtracting the component of X along the phi harmful subspace from X itself. So the expectation here is that once we do the simple subtraction, then the influence from like the background on the embedding would be minimized. So now that we have done this abstraction, so that we don't lose too much information in our embedding, we also enhance the influence of the actual useful feature. So in the previous slides, other than asking for the spurious feature, we also ask ChatGPT for like the actual useful feature. And the way to enhance this feature is other than using the subtraction like the previous step, we just do an addition. So yeah, that's kind of the whole pipeline from Roboshot, just kind of to briefly recap everything. So we always have the task description of what we want to do with the classification. So we just ask LLM, hey, I want to do a classification between water birds and land birds. Can you give me the spurious differences? And then we get kind of like the textual description of these spurious features or also the useful features. And then we embed it into the embedding space of the same model that we want to make classification on. And then once we get the embedding of the sample, we just use all of our projection business like in the previous slide. And then we use the projected embedding for the classification. That sounds really simple, but it works really well on this downstream task because the goal is we want to reduce the influence of the spurious features. There is two metrics here in the results that we care about. First is the average metric, so like the average accuracy in all groups of the classification. So like for example in the water birds, we have like water birds in front of water and water birds in front of land as like the samples that follow the pattern from the training data. But we also have like water birds in front of land and land bird in front of water, which most probably that the base model makes error in those cases. So you can see here also in the worst group is really far away from the average group because on these real slices, the model performs bad. But when we see Roboshot here, not only that we kind of slightly improve the average accuracy, we also improve the worst group accuracy by almost 30%. The classification that we do here doesn't really look anymore into the spurious correlations. Also, on top of like trying this classification on clip, we also try it also on like textual data. So we use a BERT model and also ADA model, and then we do sentiment classification. And also on the textual task, our Roboshot method works well. So we also do like an analysis on like which component is actually useful in terms of like, do we really need to do the subtraction and addition? And in most cases, when we do both of the reducing spurious correlation and increasing useful features, we get the best result. And there is this illustration on like one of the real data sets of what each step is doing. So in the original embedding, everything just kind of like scattered in the embedding space. And once we reject or like remove the spurious features, as you can see, like the variance in one direction is like really reduced. And the hope is that is the spurious feature. And when we only do the increasing non-spurious feature, then the variance in the orthogonal directions kind of like largen. And when we do both, we get this kind of like nice mixture of both.
A quick question from the audience, actually.
Mhm.
What were the size of the data sets that you investigated, and did you try any like data sets that perhaps had like 500,000 or more than 1 million size, or like can you give a rough estimate and range as to what the sizes of the data sets were?
Oh yeah. So Waterbirds is pretty small, it's around like 1,000, but Salap A is pretty big. It's around like 80,000, I believe, like 80,000 data samples in the data set. And we also try on this biomed clip, biomedical data with around like 20,000, I believe. And we actually also try it on ImageNet task set. Yes. So that's the amount of data that we use. Yes, so if you're interested in finding more details about this work, you can go to this link in this QR code. even though Roboshot works well on like the embedding based model like Clip, the next question is how to extend this to more complicated models like transformers or SSMs, where we have like for each token, we have one embedding per layer. So that's kind of one of the limitations for our current operation is it works well on a single embedding, but how do we extend it to like multiple embedding models? And another limitation is currently we're focusing on like classification tasks where the features that we want to avoid or the features that we want to use is easily describable with language. So we can actually get the textual description of what we want to use or what we want to avoid. But for more complicated tasks like LLM alignment, for example, here, like we as a human reader could potentially see like which one could be harmful and which one's like fine. But we cannot really find a textual description into like what's the difference between these. So in these cases, Roboshot is also still limited. And these two limitations kind of bring me to like the next work that I'm going to touch upon, which is still like a work in progress. So the goal is like we want to do similar things, which is like zero-shot adaptation. We don't want to fine-tune these LLMs, but we want to somehow still align it to like human preferences or kind of make it less vulnerable to jailbreaks. So the current way that people do this to align LLM with human feedbacks is pretty complicated. So let's kind of talk about that first and then see if we can find the zero-shot alternative of this process. Like given the base pre-training model, we first have to collect human preference data, which usually in a form of given a query, then we have multiple responses, and then you have to kind of give score to like these responses based on how human would prefer these responses. So you will need like human annotators, and this kind of getting the human preference data process is pretty expensive. And on top of getting this human preference data, you also have to do some sort of fancier version of fine tuning, where is RLHF or DPO, where we kind of have to get this train this reward model, and then train the base LLM using a reinforcement learning objective function. So currently there are like works that try to see if we can do this in a cheaper way. And I'm going to like go through each of these works. So the first one is like modifying the weights directly without fine tuning. Basically, the idea of this first line of work is try to find a subspace that we kind of want to get away from. And then kind of remove the subspace from the base LM model. So for example, if we do not want the LM to generate any toxic content, first we get the subspace of the toxic content by fine-tuning the base LM with toxic data to generate toxic data. So the assumption here is that the weight of the fine-tuned toxic language model is the subspace that we kind of want to remove from the base LM. So the final model is simply by subtracting the pre-trained weights with the fine-tuned or like the subspace of the toxic subspace. That's the first thing that people are trying to kind of replace RLHF or human annotation data. And the second way that people try to do this is like with guided decoding. The main idea is like instead of taking the most probable token in each decoding step, like can we somehow change these probabilities using some sort of heuristic function or like a scoring function so that it is more aligned to like the family of tokens that we want. So for example, if we want to build an LLM that kind of speak in a more Gen Z tone, we first kind of built a model that could give like bigger preferences to tokens that speak in a more Gen Z way. And then once we get this ranker, in every decoding step of the base LLM, we reweight the tokens, and then we keep choosing the tokens that align more with what we want. These two are like way cheaper than like human preference data in RLHF, but still there's like a little bottleneck. Like in the first one, we still kind of need to fine tune the LM using like separate data set that we kind of want to get away from. And also on the second one, we still need to like train a separate ranker or heuristic to do the guide the decoding. We focus on like the third method that I'm going to kind of explain what we're trying, which is modifying the language model in the embedding or activation space. But I guess like the main question now the difference between these three family of approaches is just where do we want to make the modification? So the first one is modifying it directly in the weight space. The second one is directly modifying in the token space. So what we want to try is do this modification in the embedding or activation space. Also, if like people are interested to look into works that in these families of works, then I put like citations here. Great work, you should check it out. So back to like the family of methods that we're trying. So we want to try to modify the language model in the embedding or activation space. So basically during inference, we could get like the activation values of each part of the language model, like the MLP output layer or like the attention head output layers. So the basic idea that we want to try here is, let's say we have a data set of like safe versus unsafe response. And then can we find the difference between the activation values of the language model when it generates these two responses? So the idea is once we find this difference in the activation space, can we simply steer the activation values of the language model towards the safe responses or away from the unsafe responses? So this can be done by like Roboshot-like operations or maybe simpler stuff like just simply subtracting the activation values from the hyperplane that separate safe versus unsafe responses. So this is kind of like the stuff that we're still experimenting on.
Quick question, Dia. In the
Yep.
previous slide,
Mhm.
so you mentioned that you would try to steer the activations towards preferences or concepts that you like more or are more safe.
Mhm.
How would this work on, especially on like extremely like large models which have like millions and millions of parameters? Like every single activation you're trying to steer, that would be pretty time consuming, right? Or is it only a few, say, activation layers that you're trying to steer, or is it the entire subset of weights?
Yes, that's a good question. So basically, what usually we try is just kind of at the end layers of the MLP. So if we talk about like the outputs of the MLPs for like 32 layers, then we only have like 32 activation values. But then also like when we experiment, turns out like the initial layers doesn't really change the outputs that much. So mostly we only experiment on like the middle to the last layer.
Okay, got it. I guess that greatly decreases the subset or like the number of activations that you need to change or make changes with.
Yep.
Great presentation. I have a question.
Mhm.
So identifying like spurious components is embedding space is really interesting. I'm curious, have you seen like supervisory approaches that kind of use this concept of targeting the spurious components and subtracting them out? So for example, like in like if you're making a preference data set, right? I'm curious if you've seen anything that's been where like not only the ranking, but the explanation for why it is a spurious component or like why one thing is better than the other in free-form text has been useful as supervisory signal.
Oh, so you mean like with adding explanation on why stuff is good versus why stuff is bad?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I actually never really see any work that kind of do that in like a textual form, but there is this very interesting work from the UCLA lab where they kind of use a heat map as some sort of supervisory. I could like send you this work if you're interested in.
Yeah, that'd be super interesting. Thank you. I'm also interested like comments on image as an artifact of like classification data sets. Like they're a natural byproduct. And in my mind, that's like specifically targeting the spurious components. So be curious to see the method. Yep.
Yeah, I could find the link for you and just kind of, if I can find your email, I could email it to you.
Awesome. I'll send it in the chat. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm actually almost done with the presentation. Just kind of want to show like the preliminary result of this very simple operation that we're doing for alignment. This is on like a very specific sample. So on a query that kind of asks like, how do I cheat on a poker game? By just simply changing the activation value. If you read the vanilla model response versus our response, in the vanilla model, it kind of like still tell you possibly what to do to like cheat on poker, but our stuff like completely changed the intent of the vanilla model, and that's simply by like steering this activation value business that we talked about in the previous slide. And also like one of the early numbers is like we get a 7% net win rate from the base model with like pretty simple operations in the activation space. So yeah, that kind of concludes the talk. Basically, like we get promising results from embedding manipulation and embedding based model. And the next step that we're looking at is, can we do the zero-shot adaptation on more complicated task and more complicated model, like adapting transformers model. So yeah, that's concludes the presentation. Thank you for listening.
I noticed that, especially with the water birds, land birds example, right? It seemed to be like a binary classification. So you can ask ChatGPT or whatever the language model is, what is the difference between, or spurious correlations between water birds and land birds? How would we deal in the scenario where perhaps we have more than two classes? So if you have, say, water birds, land birds, and say tree birds as well, how would you get the differences between like all three of them? Would you have to like send like every permutation and combination of prompts, or is there a better way to do it?
Oh, yeah. So actually, also on the binary class, we get like one description for every class. So for example, in waterbird and landbird, we get like land background and water background. So for multiple classes, we just have like this multiple kind of characteristic for like all the classes. But the difference is just for binary classes, when we do the debiasing, we debias to the subspace of like class 1 minus class 2, which doesn't really matter, like class 2 minus class 1, because the degree of freedom is only 1. But when I have like classes more than 2, I just kind of do like the debiasing iteratively. So like class 1 versus class 2, class 1 versus class 3, and so on and so on. When the class gets a lot, I think like the most we get is around 7 classes. I don't do all possible permutations because it takes a while. So I just kind of sample from like the top 10, or it's also a heuristic. Yeah, that's what.
Okay, so you're just say it again. You're not finding the differences between like every single permutation or combination of classes. When it gets too much and it becomes like kind of exponential, at that point you'll be like, hey, I'll just choose a sample or a subset of classes and only project on those and then compute whatever changes I need to do to the embedding. Okay, that makes sense. And one other follow-up question that I had is, how would we apply this in a multi-label setting where an image or whatever image or text, whatever it is, can belong to more than one class? Because if you're debiasing it against other classes, then if that certain item belongs to more than one class, how would you go about resolving that?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I guess like that would be easier to just do like the spurious one, because usually for spurious correlations, it is spurious against all classes. So you would want to remove that feature from every class. But it is more tricky for the useful feature. So for example, like the waterbirds case, background is spurious against any class.
Okay.
You would want to remove. So in that case, like also during the rebuttal, we are asked to like do our experiment on ImageNet. So what we did is we do only the spurious feature deletion on like classes, because when you want to do the useful feature, then when you have a lot of classes, it's also like it's very similar against each class, right? Like if you want to classify different types of dogs, then some features are really similar, so you wouldn't want to like remove it. but the spurious is the same for everything, usually.
So generally what you've noticed is that regardless of the number of classes there are, what is spurious for one class usually is spurious for other classes. So deleting it or getting rid of it helps overall in the classification, regardless of the number of classes. Interesting.
That's what
Okay.
yes.
Interesting. Okay. Thanks. Just like to say thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thank you so much, Dia, as well, for taking the time and presenting to us. And by the way, you said that this has already been accepted at ICLR as well, right?
The Roboshot, yes.
Okay, congratulations. Anyway, thanks so much, Dia. Thanks so much for taking the time. Forward to seeing you in the next one as well. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.